In just 48 hours, over 750,000 people lost their homes. They didn't die in a natural disaster or a war zone in some distant country. They were uprooted from their land right in their own backyard, and most of them never came back. This is what happened in 1948 Palestine, and it's not a simple story of good versus evil. It's messy, it's complicated, and it changed millions of lives forever. For decades, people have only heard pieces of this story. Some know about Israel's independence. Others know about Palestinian displacement. But very few understand what actually happened on the ground. The real story involves broken promises, missed opportunities for peace, desperate families, and a chain of events that spiraled into something nobody could fully control. By the end of this video, you'll understand how we got here, why it happened the way it did, and why this moment in 1948 still matters today. Because the conflict we see in the news right now, it all traces back to these events. Let's start with something most people don't realize. Before 1948, Jews and Palestinians actually lived alongside each other for hundreds of years. Yes, there was tension sometimes, but nothing like what we think of today. They shared the same land, they traded with each other, they knew their neighbors. But starting around the 1880s, something began to shift. European Jews started moving to Palestine in larger numbers. This wasn't random. It was a movement called Zionism, and the basic idea was simple. Jewish people had been persecuted and scattered throughout Europe for centuries, and they wanted a homeland of their own, a place where they could have safety and self-determination. On the surface, that sounds reasonable. Everyone wants a home where they feel safe. But here's where the problem started. The land they chose, it wasn't empty. Palestinians had been living there, farming the land, building villages, and raising families for generations. Around 700,000 Palestinians were already living in Palestine at the beginning of the 20th century. At first, there wasn't huge conflict because the numbers were still relatively small. The Jewish population in Palestine was only around 85,000 in 2020, but after World War I ended, something happened that changed everything. The Balfour Declaration. In 1917, the British government made a promise. They said they would support the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. This sounds like the British were being generous. But here's the thing they did that nobody talks about. Britain didn't own Palestine to promise it to anyone. Palestine was under Ottoman control at the time, and after World War I, the British got a temporary control over the area through something called a League of Nations mandate. Basically, they were supposed to help Palestine become independent. Instead, they basically told Jewish immigrants, "Go ahead, we'll help you build a homeland here." While Palestinians were already living there, the Palestinian population was shocked. These were their lands, this was their home. And now they were being told that a foreign power was bringing in people from Europe to settle in their country. Things got tense quickly. In the 1920s and 1930s, more Jewish immigrants arrived. They bought land, they built communities, and Palestinian workers sometimes lost jobs to new arrivals. Riots broke out in places like Jerusalem and Hebron. People died. Families were torn apart. But the immigration didn't stop. Actually, it got worse. In the 1930s, as Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany and anti-Semitic laws started spreading across Europe, thousands more Jewish refugees fled to Palestine. This wasn't their choice exactly. They were running for their lives. By 1939, right as World War II was starting, the British got nervous. They didn't want a full-scale uprising in Palestine, so they limited the number of Jewish immigrants allowed in. But this just created more tension. Jews fleeing the Holocaust were turned away while Palestinians felt increasingly crowded out of their own land. After World War II ended in 1945, the Holocaust was exposed to the world. Millions of Jewish people had been murdered simply because they were Jewish. The international community felt guilty. They looked at the suffering of Jewish people and thought, they deserve a homeland. What they didn't do was ask the Palestinians if they were okay with that plan. In 1947, the United Nations voted on something called the Partition Plan. This was a proposal to divide Palestine into two states, one for Jews and one for Palestinians. The vote happened in November, and it passed. The plan said about 56% of the land would go to a new Jewish state, even though Jewish people only made up about 32% of the population. Here's the thing about that plan. It wasn't exactly terrible for Palestinians. They would have gotten land too. The problem was how the land was divided. The best land, the most connected parts, went to the Jewish state. Palestinian areas were split up into 3 separate pieces that didn't even connect to each other. It was like being given a puzzle with missing pieces. Jewish leaders debated about this. Some said it wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. They accepted the plan. Palestinian leaders, on the other hand, rejected it completely. They said the plan was unfair. They said the international community had no right to partition their land without asking them. Over the next few months, tensions got worse. Arab leaders in neighboring countries said they wouldn't accept a Jewish state in Palestine. Jewish militias in Palestine started preparing for war because they could tell that blood was coming. In May 1948, David Ben-Gurion, the leader of the Jewish community in Palestine, did something bold. He declared that the state of Israel existed. He didn't wait for everything to be perfect or for everyone to agree. He just declared independence. The moment he said those words, everything erupted. Arab nations surrounding Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, and Iraq sent armies into Palestine to prevent the state from existing. What they called a war of liberation, Israelis called a war of independence. Palestinians called it the Nakba, which means catastrophe in Arabic. The battles were brutal. Israeli forces, which had been training secretly for years, were actually better organized than people expected. Arab armies fought hard but were less coordinated. As the fighting spread, something terrible happened. Palestinians started fleeing their homes. This is the part that still causes arguments today. How did over 700,000 Palestinians end up leaving their homes? Did they flee because of direct military threats? Were they forced out? Did they leave thinking they'd come back once the fighting was over? The truth is that it was a mixture of everything. In some cases, Israeli military commanders directly ordered Palestinians out. In other cases, Palestinians left because they heard rumors that Israeli forces were coming, and they were terrified. In some towns, Israel's military deliberately used violence against civilians to terrify them into leaving. One place that shows this clearly is Deir Yassin. In April 1948, before the official war even started, Israeli militia attacked this village. They killed around 250 Palestinians, mostly civilians. After that attack, entire communities decided they had to leave. They couldn't stay if this was what was coming. As Palestinians fled, they left behind everything. Houses with furniture still inside, photos on the walls, food in the kitchens. They thought they'd be back in a few weeks, once things calmed down. They never came back. These Palestinian refugees poured into neighboring countries. Jordan took hundreds of thousands. Egypt took tens of thousands. Lebanon took over 100,000. Syria took around 75,000. These weren't organized, managed movements. These were desperate families walking or driving with whatever they could carry, wondering if they'd ever see home again. Refugee camps were built quickly, just temporary structures to house these people. Tents made of canvas, tin shacks, no running water in many places, no electricity. People were packed in, living in poverty and trauma, separated from everything they knew. For years, the United Nations called for Palestinian refugees to be allowed to return to their homes. Israel said no. They said if millions of Palestinians came back, there wouldn't be a Jewish state anymore. It would be outnumbered, so the refugees stayed in camps. Year after year, their children were born in camps. Their children had children born in camps. Generational trauma set in. People watched their kids grow up in poverty with no real future. Some Palestinians did stay in the lands that became Israel, around 150,000 of them, but they were minorities in a new state that was built for Jewish people. They faced discrimination in jobs, in housing, in basically every part of life. They had fewer rights than Jewish citizens. The 1948 war ended around 1949, but it didn't end the conflict. The Arab countries rejected the new state of Israel and refused to negotiate peace. Israel, on the other hand, was determined to secure its borders and build a nation. The damage was already done, though. An entire population had been displaced. Families were separated by borders they didn't choose. Palestinians who had lived on their land for centuries were now refugees. They held keys to homes they could no longer enter. They had deeds to land they could no longer farm. What's important to understand is that this wasn't some smooth, inevitable process. There were moments where things could have gone differently. If the partition plan had been accepted by both sides and implemented fairly, there might have been two peaceful states living side by side. If the British had managed the transition better after World War I, maybe the tensions wouldn't have gotten so bad. If the international community had paid attention to Palestinian concerns instead of just feeling sorry for Holocaust survivors, maybe compromises could have been reached. But none of that happened. Instead, decisions were made by powerful countries thousands of miles away, and the people living in Palestine paid the price. Today, over 5 million Palestinians are still refugees or descendants of refugees. Most of them have never been back to the land their families came from. Israel, meanwhile, built a nation that today is a technological and military powerhouse. But underneath all of that success is this history that has never been resolved. The reason I'm telling you this story is because you can't understand what's happening in Palestine and Israel today without understanding 1948. Every conflict, every negotiation, every argument going forward traces back to this moment. Palestinians still mourn their losses from the Nakba. Israelis celebrate their independence on May 14th every year. But one celebration for one group is a day of mourning for another. This doesn't have a simple answer. There's no way to undo what happened in 1948. The people who lived through it are mostly gone now. The land has changed. Entire cities have been built. Generations have grown up knowing nothing else. But understanding this history is the first step to understanding the conflict as it exists today. It's not just about politics or religion or land disputes. It's about human beings whose lives were fundamentally changed by events they often had no control over. Subscribe to learn more untold stories from history that still shape our world today.